I always find it interesting when I see apologists reacting to challenges by getting angry, or at least play acting as if they're angry. Inspiring Philosophy is a good example of this. Let's take a look at a clip here where he responds to someone talking about a difficult passage in Matthew.
Christians don't talk about this verse because they're not able to account for it.
We talk about it all the time because you guys won't shut up about it.
So we are presented with a challenging verse. It's the passage that speaks of individuals who rise from the graves after the resurrection. This story is only found in Matthew. No one else seems to be aware that this occurred. It's not mentioned in any other gospel, nor in Paul, or even in Josephus. Simply, it's a strange story that we need to talk about, and often don't. There's a lot of ways we can discuss this passage. However, responding in anger and accusing people of not shutting up really isn't the way to go. It instantly stops the conversation. It puts the other side on the defensive, which is something that they aren't necessarily doing on purpose. Instead, it's a natural reaction when we feel attacked. In this case, it also suggests something else, that what Inspiring is attempting to do here is not to have a real conversation or even to persuade the other side, but instead, the goal is only to speak to those who already believe like he does, which is a much easier task because you don't really have to deal with the potential issues. Inspiring isn't alone here, as the other creator is guilty of the same thing. Both are just opposite sides of the same coin, as their tactics are almost identical, and neither one really wants to have a conversation. They just want to speak into an echo chamber. That really is clear in the next clip.
What this means is that there was a zombie apocalypse after Jesus died and resurrected.
To refer to this as a zombie apocalypse is disingenuous at best, and much like what Inspiring also did, it cuts off any real discussion. But real discussion was never the actual point, which is a bit disappointing as a real discussion can be had here. Now first, we have to refrain from the zombie language, as whether or not it could technically be correct is irrelevant as the term zombie is quite loaded and carries a good amount of baggage. It also misses the overall theme here, which is about the resurrection. This refers back to the general resurrection, which within Jewish thought dealt with God's justice. It is this framework that Matthew is working within and that he's building off of. Now, jumping into this sort of breakdown could have built up some conversation. Inspiring takes a different route, though.
No, that's an uncharitable representation from your non-Christian bias, and you know it.
So Inspiring may be correct here, but he's also being hypocritical because he opened his initial response by being uncharitable, and he most likely would have realized this. He's really acting in the same manner as the other creator. The only difference is which side of the topic they are on. They both approach this in the same manner with the same disdain for the other side. All that this does is make the other side dig more into their own views while ignoring the opposition. It furthers the divide. And the thing is, Inspiring could have easily skipped this. He could have moved on to his actual point, which is,
there wouldn't have been any zombies because these people would have been resuscitated.
Now, this response isn't the greatest because instead of actually addressing the problem, he kind of sidesteps it. As I mentioned previously, we should refrain from the zombie language. But to simply say no, they aren't zombies because they resuscitated isn't really an argument. It really doesn't change the point, and in many ways still plays into this zombie narrative. Now, one could make an argument that these individuals are not technically zombies, as traditionally, a zombie was an animated corpse that was raised by magical means. Within Haitian folklore, where we see these ideas developing, a zombie would remain under the control of the sorcerer or witch that revived it. Thus, a zombie would have no will of its own. However, since the origins of these ideas, there have been additional developments within this folklore, and we get a more modern portrayal that lacks some of the characteristics of the traditional lore. So this all becomes a bit more complicated. But if we put this into the framework of the general resurrection and see it as representing not a historical event, but a portrayal of a different sort of truth, then the whole zombie issue becomes a non-issue. And we actually get into the matter at hand. Even though talking about zombie lore is fascinating in its own right. But let's go on.
Second, it would not have been a lot of people, let alone an apocalypse. In that day and age, only the wealthy could afford tombs, and it says only the godly men and women came out.
Arguing that it wouldn't actually be an apocalypse because there weren't many who rose from the grave is an interesting tactic, because it doesn't actually address the underlying problem here, it just minimizes it. The problem would still persist, just in a slightly lesser form. We'd still be looking at hundreds of individuals who were raised, which begs a question that the creator is getting at. Why did no one mention this? Even if we minimize that amount of people raised, we're still looking at something quite significant. But let's see how Inspiring tries to minimize this a bit more.
Bodies would only be in tombs for about a year. After that, relatives would go back in, collect the bones, and then place them in a bone box.
This argument is just historically flawed. While the bones of individuals would be collected and placed into an ossuary, or a bone box, this ossuary would then once again be placed inside, well, that tomb. So when we're looking at these tombs, they would often contain the ossuaries of many individuals, meaning, while we have many tombs around Jerusalem, those tombs didn't contain just one individual, but many. This is a major misstep here, as this argument he's making actually increases the issue for him, because the practice of secondary burial in an ossuary, which were then placed into these tombs, only increased the number of individuals who could have been raised. Now, honestly, I think this entire argument is flawed from the get-go, because it assumes the story is historical and then tries to minimize the impact. Instead, we can just see it as portraying a different sort of truth. I think Inspiring does realize this, though.
But that might not be what Matthew is trying to say.
And that's probably how the conversation should have began. Instead of trying to minimize the problem, we could actually get to the heart of the matter. Inspiring doesn't really seize on this, though.
The scholar Mike Lacona has made the case that Matthew was probably just using poetic or apocalyptic language of the time.
Honestly, I think it is this route that the majority of the conversation should have been on, because there is so much here that could be discussed. We could go back to the discussion of the general resurrection and how the early Christians were operating within this Jewish framework. For instance, Paul touches on this when he calls Jesus the first fruit. It also makes better sense of the eschatological views that Jesus puts forth, as a general resurrection is part of this viewpoint. It all really ties together and gives us a better understanding of what Jesus was preaching and what the early Christians were teaching. Sure, this may be a bit more difficult to dive into, as it requires some understanding of Jewish ideology, but it's a conversation worth having. But the difficult discussions aren't what everyone wants.
In other words, it's very easy for Christians to account for this passage. You just need to use a little critical thinking and do some research.
Because in apologetics, easy answers tend to be more useful, or at least attempting to make the answer seem easy is more useful, as it portrays the other side as incompetent. After all, if it's so easy and the other side fails to get it, clearly that means that there's something wrong with them. This is why I have such a problem with apologetics. At its core, I find it often to be dishonest. Instead of having real discussions, they speak into echo chambers. Instead of actually trying to have a conversation with the other side, they play act as being angry or indignant, and in turn stop any real conversation. Instead of actually admitting that any of this can be difficult, they attempt to demean the other side by portraying all of this as being so easy. And if someone cared to know the truth, they only had to do a little bit of research. Now, maybe this is a good way to keep people in the faith, but it does very little to bring people into the faith or even build a real respect for the faith. Instead, I think we need to have more open and honest discussions. And if you would like to have some of these open, honest discussions, give me a like, give me a follow, and we'll continue this into the next videos.